Wheeler Field, Hawaii. December 7, 1941, 07:55 hours. Second Lieutenant George Welch is still in the tuxedo trousers he wore to last night's dinner dance. He has not slept. Across the lawn of the Officers Club, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor hears the first bombs fall on the hangar line. The two men are 22 and 23 years old. They are flight commanders in the 47th Pursuit Squadron, exiled to a dirt strip on the north shore of Oahu because their gunnery scores were poor. Taylor runs to a telephone and calls Haleiwa Field, armed 2 P-40s. He and Welch climb into Taylor's Buick and cover the 10 miles at 100 miles per hour, strafed by a Japanese fighter on the way. At Haleiwa, a crew chief suggests they disperse the aircraft rather than launch them. Welch answers, "To hell with that." By 08:30, they are airborne in 2 Curtiss P-40B Warhawks, a fighter the United States Army had already branded obsolete. In the next 90 minutes, those 2 aircraft will score 6 confirmed kills. They will be the first American aerial victories of the Second World War, and they will be flown by a machine that the Senate of the United States would, 3 years later, call at best a second choice. This is the story of how an aircraft condemned before it ever flew in anger carried the weight of American air power for 36 months, until the Mustang was ready to take over. To understand why the P-40 was considered obsolete in December 1941, you have to understand what the United States Army Air Corps had decided a fighter was for. In the mid-1930s, American doctrine held that the bomber would always get through. Fighters were a secondary arm, intended for low-altitude coastal defense and close support. They did not need to climb to 30,000 feet. They did not need turbo superchargers. They needed to be cheap, rugged, and available in large numbers. That decision shaped everything that followed. When Curtiss Chief Engineer Donovan Reese Berlin began work on a new pursuit aircraft in 1937, he did not design from a clean sheet. He took the 10th production airframe of the existing P-36 Hawk, bolted on a liquid-cooled Allison V 1710 engine, and called it the XP-40. It flew for the first time on October 14, 1938, at Buffalo, New York, with Curtiss test pilot Everett Elliott at the controls. The prototype reached 342 miles per hour. That was slower than the Spitfire already flying in England, and slower than the Messerschmitt 109 already in Luftwaffe service. Both of those aircraft had 2-stage superchargers. The Allison did not. Above 15,000 feet, the P-40's engine lost power in a way the European machines did not. When the prototype was evaluated against the Spitfire Mark I at Royal Canadian Air Force Station Uplands in May 1940, the verdict was unambiguous. The Spitfire was better. The Royal Air Force, receiving Tomahawk 1s without armor, without self-sealing tanks, without armored glass, deemed the aircraft unsuitable for the European theater and relegated it to Army Cooperation Command. Soviet testers in autumn 1941 ranked the Tomahawk below their own Yak-1. Aviation historian Joe Barr summarizes the contemporary verdict without flinching. The P-40 was obsolete by European standards even before the first prototype flew, and it never did catch up. And yet on April 26, 1939, the United States Army placed an order for 524 P-40s at a cost of $13 million, the largest single aircraft contract the American military had ever signed. The reason was simple. It was the only modern fighter the American aviation industry could actually build in volume. Everything else was still on paper. The first production P-40 flew on April 4, 1940. By June, the 33rd, 35th, and 36th Pursuit Squadrons at Langley Field were receiving them. By the end of 1941, more than 130 P-40Bs had been delivered. Each one carried 2.50 caliber machine guns in the cowl and 4.30 caliber guns in the wings. Each one had a single-stage Allison rated at 1,040 horsepower. Each one was a compromise. The British version, the Tomahawk 2A, gave the aircraft a nickname borrowed from the Plains Indians. A later variant, the Kitty Hawk, introduced a bigger engine and 6.50 caliber guns. But the basic problem remained. Above 15,000 feet, the P-40 ran out of breath. The principal rival in American eyes was not yet a real aircraft. The North American P-51 Mustang had flown in prototype form in October 1940, but the version that would make it famous, the Merlin-powered P-51B, would not enter combat until December 1943. For 36 months, there was no Mustang. There was only the P-40. The test pilot assessments were brutal. One early evaluation noted that the aircraft was a solid gun platform with good dive characteristics, but that its climb and ceiling were inferior to every frontline European fighter then in service. Test pilot Benjamin Kelsey, flying the prototype at Wright Field, managed only 315 miles per hour on his first flight, and famously hid his disappointment from the press. The radiator placement had to be redesigned in full-scale wind tunnel tests at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics facility at Langley over 2 weeks in the spring of 1939 before the aircraft achieved even its modest rated speed. Compare that to the Mustang that would replace it. The P-51D, powered by a two-stage Packard Merlin, could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It had a service ceiling of 41,900 feet. With full external fuel, it could fly 2,300 miles. The P-40E, by contrast, managed 362 miles per hour at 15,000 feet and ran out of useful power above that. The Mustang held rated power to 30,000 feet. The Warhawk did not. According to Joe Barr's detailed production records, the radiator chin scoop, the shape that would become the aircraft's visual signature, was forced onto the design by wind tunnel testing, not chosen from the start. Everything about the P-40 was a solution to a problem the designer had not anticipated. Then came the one thing that made the aircraft work. What the P-40 lacked in altitude performance, it possessed in raw structural strength. Its wing was built around 5 spars. Its dive performance, measured against every American and European contemporary, was exceptional. At speeds above 250 miles per hour, the P-40 could outroll and outdive anything that might chase it, and it could absorb damage. Wing Commander Clive Caldwell, the Royal Australian Air Force ace, who would become the highest-scoring P-40 pilot of any nation, said the aircraft would take a tremendous amount of punishment, violent aerobatics, as well as enemy action. Retired Captain Claire Lee Chennault, commanding the American Volunteer Group in China, understood the implication before anyone else. In the spring of 1941, Chennault issued a tactical order to his pilots that inverted everything they had been taught at flight school. Never, never, in a P-40, try to outmaneuver and perform acrobatics with a Japanese aircraft. Climb above the enemy. Dive on them. Fire one pass. Climb away. Do not turn with them. This became known as boom and zoom. It was not a maneuver the Army Air Corps had taught. It was a tactical adaptation forced by the specific strengths and weaknesses of a specific aircraft, and it meant that the pilot, armed with altitude, could fight on his own terms rather than the enemy's. That single change turned a mediocre fighter into a deadly one. If you are finding this interesting, subscribing takes a second and helps the channel. Chennault's pilots would prove the point within days of Pearl Harbor. On December 20, 1941, just 13 days after Welch and Taylor took off from Haleiwa, 34 P-40s of the American Volunteer Group intercepted 10 unescorted Japanese Ki-48 bombers over Kunming in southwestern China. The spotter network of Chinese civilians on the ground, which Life magazine would call the best air raid warning system in existence, had tracked the bombers from Hanoi. The Flying Tigers were waiting above them at altitude. They dove. 4 bombers fell from the sky. 1 P-40 crash-landed after running out of fuel. No Flying Tiger pilot was lost. Chennault, watching from the ground, made one terse comment: "Not good enough. Next time, get 'em all." Over the next 6 months, the Flying Tigers would claim 297 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of 14 pilots in combat. Later research by historian Daniel Ford, cross-referencing Japanese records, suggests the actual aerial total was closer to 115. Even at the lower figure, the kill-to-loss ratio outperformed every other Allied unit fighting Japan in the first half of the war. The aircraft the Flying Tigers flew was the same P-40 that American and British planners had already declared obsolete. Elsewhere, the pattern repeated. In the Philippines, First Lieutenant Boyd Wagner of the 17th Pursuit Squadron became the first American ace of the Second World War on December 16, 1941, when he led a P-40 strike on Vigan, destroyed 9 aircraft on the ground, and scored his 5th aerial kill, 4 days ahead of the Flying Tigers. In Australia, 60 P-40Es of the 49th Fighter Group provided the only fighter defense of Darwin from March to September 1942, destroying 19 Japanese aircraft for 19 P-40s lost in combat. A 1-to-1 ratio, achieved against an enemy holding nearly every tactical advantage. In the Aleutian Islands, the 11th Fighter Squadron, renamed the Aleutian Tigers after Claire Chennault's son Colonel John Chennault took command, flew P-40Es from Umnak, Adak, and Amchitka, in conditions where weather killed more pilots than the enemy. The first raids on Japanese-held Kiska flew on September 14, 1942. Over the Russian front, more than 2,400 P-40s were delivered under Lend-Lease. Soviet ace Boris Safonov, the first man twice named Hero of the Soviet Union, was flying a P-40E when he was killed covering convoy PQ-16 on May 30, 1942. And then came North Africa. On April 18, 1943, 46 P-40F Warhawks of the 57th Fighter Group and the 314th Squadron launched from airfields in Tunisia, covered above by 18 Spitfire 5s of 92 Squadron Royal Air Force. Their target was the Axis Air Bridge evacuating troops from Tunisia to Sicily. At wave-top level off Cape Bon, the formation intercepted more than 100 Junkers, 52 transport aircraft, escorted by approximately 50 Messerschmitt 109s, Messerschmitt 110s, and Mach-E 202s. Mission Commander Captain James Curl looked down and spoke into his radio. Juicy, juicy, juicy. Let's get 'em, boys. In roughly 15 minutes, the P-40s claimed 77 enemy aircraft destroyed. Post-war German records confirmed 24 Junkers, 52s destroyed outright, and 35 damaged beyond repair in a single engagement. The cost to the 57th Fighter Group was 6 P-40s and 1 Spitfire. 4 new American aces were made in a single afternoon. Stars and Stripes, reporting the action, called it the greatest single aerial engagement since the Battle of Britain, if not in all history. Tunisia surrendered within 30 days. The event entered Allied operational history as the Palm Sunday Massacre. 3 months later, 36 P-40Fs of the 325th Fighter Group flew a sweep over Sardinia on July 30, 1943. 21 of 25 intercepting Messerschmitt 109s were destroyed for the loss of 1 P-40. The 325th Fighter Group, the Checkertail Clan, would finish the war with a kill-to-loss ratio of roughly 8-1 in the P-40. The 57th Fighter Group, first in the Mediterranean, had flown its P-40Fs off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ranger on July 19, 1942, a launch method the aircraft was not designed for. Across every theater, the record was the same. The aircraft the pre-war planners had condemned was, in combat, decisive. By any measure, the P-51 Mustang was the superior aircraft. Its top speed was 70 miles per hour higher. Its service ceiling was nearly 10,000 feet greater. Its range, with drop tanks, allowed it to escort Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses to Berlin and back, a mission the P-40 could not fly under any configuration. When the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program issued its report in 1944, it called the Mustang, in the words of both the British and the United States Army Air Forces, the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. It called the P-40, in the same document, at best a second choice. None of that mattered in 1941, 1942, or most of 1943, because the Mustang was not there. The Merlin-powered P-51B did not enter combat until December 1, 1943, with the 354th Fighter Group over France. The first Berlin escort mission was flown on March 4, 1944. Before those dates, the Mustang existed only as the Allison-powered P-51A, which served in limited numbers in the China-Burma-India theater in late 1943. For the 36 months between Pearl Harbor and the Mustang's combat debut, American fighter aviation was carried, in numerical terms, by the P-40. It defended Pearl Harbor. It held the Philippines as long as they could be held. It was the only American fighter at Darwin. It broke the Japanese Army Air Force over Kunming and Rangoon. It flew off carriers into Morocco for Operation Torch. It fought Rommel's air arm across Libya and Tunisia. It annihilated the Axis transport fleet at Cape Bon. And it did all of this while the aircraft that would later take the credit was still being tested, retooled, and re-engined. The numbers tell a different story than the reputation. More than 200 Allied pilots became aces in the P-40. At least 46 of them were from British Commonwealth Air Forces. 18 Royal Australian Air Force pilots reached ace status on the type. The 325th Fighter Group's kill-to-loss ratio was roughly 8-1. The American Volunteer Group's ratio, even under the most conservative post-war revisions, was superior to any other Allied unit fighting Japan in the same period. When Curtiss President Guy Vaughan defended the aircraft before the Truman Committee in 19 1944. His argument was a single sentence. The P-40 has been continuously modernized, has shot down from 3 to 20 enemy planes for every P-40 lost. The committee noted his point, but kept its verdict. The Mustang was better. Everyone agreed. The question the committee did not answer was the one that mattered. What would have filled the skies over Kunming, Darwin, and Cape Bon if the P-40 had not been built? Production of the Warhawk ended on November 30, 1944, when the 13,738th airframe rolled off the Curtiss line in Buffalo, New York. That made it the third most produced American fighter of the Second World War, behind only the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. It served with approximately 18 Allied nations in combat or post-war use. The popular figure of 28 nations is a myth, traceable to a commemorative paint scheme applied to the 15,000th Curtiss aircraft of any type. The real number, confirmed against National Air Force records, is smaller, but it still spans 6 continents. The last major operator was the Brazilian Air Force, which retired the P-40 in 1954 after a fatal wing spar failure. Approximately 77 airframes survive worldwide. 20 are airworthy. The oldest of them, P-40B Serial 41-13297, is a Pearl Harbor veteran, pulled from a Wheeler Field hangar where it sat under repair on the morning of the attack. It flies today at the Fighter Collection at Duxford. The myth that the P-40 could not turn is false. At combat speeds above 250 miles per hour, its 5-spar wing allowed it to outroll and outturn the Japanese Zero. The myth that the Flying Tigers invented the shark-mouth nose art is also false. They copied it in November 1941 from a newspaper photograph of a Royal Air Force 112 Squadron Tomahawk in Egypt. That squadron had copied it from a Luftwaffe Messerschmitt 110 unit over Crete, which had copied it from a German reconnaissance aircraft of the First World War. What is true is that the P-40 was condemned in writing before the war began, and that it won the fights that no one else could fight, because no one else had arrived yet. The Truman Committee was not wrong about the Mustang. The Mustang was the better aircraft, but the Warhawk bought the time that allowed the Mustang to exist. Without those 36 months, there would have been no 4 March 1944, no escort to Berlin, no Luftwaffe broken in the sky. The records prove it. The documents confirm it. Pearl Harbor, Kunming, Darwin, Cape Bon. The aircraft that was never supposed to matter mattered most. At the moment it was needed most, because it was the only aircraft there. That is the Warhawk. That is what the second choice did.